Is that really how you'd treat a quiet man while the flag rope clicked against the cafe pole at dawn and he knelt only to steady a neighbor's chair? They mocked him for kneeling, pressed by rules that never once looked him in the eye as whispers trailed after him like dust. Then his old challenge coin caught a faint glow and the room slipped into that heartbeat silence where memories lift themselves back into the light. Still quiet, men leave echoes too. And this is where his began. The morning sun settled gently over Spring Willow Cafe, warming the boards of the small wooden deck where Frank knelt beside an old chair. He worked slowly, sanding a splintered edge for Mrs. Carter, who watched from inside with the patient fondness of someone who had known him half a lifetime. Frank's movements were steady, practiced hands that had once carried heavier burdens, now choosing the quiet dignity of fixing what could still be saved. A soft breeze lifted the scent of coffee through the doorway as he leaned in, tightening the last screw. That was when a shadow crossed the porch. Harold, clipboard tucked tight against his chest, stepped forward with the stiff posture of a man who believed rules were best delivered without warmth. "Frank," he said, clearing his throat, "you're blocking the entrance. Regulations don't allow that." Frank looked up, his eyes kind but tired. He hadn't meant to be in the way. He shifted aside, brushing sawdust from his jeans, but something in Harold's tone, flat official, pressed on him more heavily than the morning air. It felt like a quiet command to bow his head, though all he'd done was help a neighbor. "Just finishing up for Mrs. Carter," Frank said softly. "Intent doesn't change the rule," Harold replied. Frank nodded, letting the weight settle. The familiar pressure of protocol, not cruel, just unbending, rested on his shoulders, the way cold weather rested on old wounds. He stood wiping his palms on a rag, careful not to meet the stares from a couple waiting by the rail. They stepped aside politely, but their eyes lingered a moment too long. He reached for his wallet to pay for a refill he hadn't even taken a sip of yet. As he opened it, a small glint caught the sun. A round edge of metal, smooth, worn from years of being turned between thoughtful fingers, flashed once before he closed it again. The challenge coin had been with him longer than most folks in this town had known his name. Lena, the young barista carrying a tray of cups, paused mid-step. "Mr. Frank, was that?" Before she could finish, Harold cut in. "Lena, doors still blocked. Let's keep things moving." She blinked, startled, then hurried past. The moment slipped away as quickly as it had begun. Frank stepped aside fully, letting Harold usher in the waiting pair. He didn't argue. Arguing never made mornings easier. Instead, he glanced toward the old flag mounted above the cafe window. Its edges were frayed, faded by seasons of Colorado wind, yet it still hung there with a quiet insistence. Something in it steadied him, the way certain memories anchor a man even when the present tries to tilt him off balance. He gathered his tools and straightened the chair, giving the wood one last reassuring pat. From behind the glass, Mrs. Carter pressed her hand to her heart in thanks. Frank offered a small smile, gentle as a nod between old friends. Folks drifted past the porch conversations, carrying on without him. Yet in their brief glances, he felt the faint tremor of a misunderstanding already forming, small, almost harmless, like a spark catching on dry grass. He didn't know then how far one small rumor could travel. The line at the Spring Willow post office moved at its usual slow, meandering pace, the kind that made people talk just to pass the time. Frank stood near the back. Hands folded, shoulders relaxed, trying not to take up too much space. The building smelled faintly of paper floor wax and winter coats that hadn't yet been stored away for the season. Ahead of him, 2 volunteers from the community center whispered over their envelopes. "Did you hear?" one murmured. "They say Frank caused a scene at the cafe yesterday." Harold said he wouldn't follow the rules, the other replied, as if that alone confirmed the story. Their voices weren't sharp, just casually, certain, the sort of certainty that made small towns both comforting and difficult. Rumors didn't need heat to spread. Warmth could carry them just fine. Frank dipped his head politely when they turned, slightly catching sight of him. "Morning," he offered. They smiled back, but the smiles didn't settle in their eyes. He'd seen that look before, half curiosity, half wariness, while waiting in lines just like this many years ago in places that smelled of canvas and dust instead of envelopes and ink. Lena entered the post office, then, cheeks pink from the cold, her apron still tied over her jeans. She spotted Frank and brightened. "Mr. Frank, about yesterday was that coin you had." Before she could finish, Harold stepped out from the counter, hallway clipboard in hand, as always. "Lena, we try to keep the line moving here," he said. "Let's not distract the customers." She blinked, caught off guard again. "Oh yes, sorry." Frank offered her a small shake of his head to let her know it was all right. She gave him a hesitant smile before moving to the back of the line. He reached into his pocket, curling his fingers around the challenge coin. The metal felt cool, familiar. When he drew his hand back out to adjust his wallet, a sliver of light bounced from the coin's edge just enough to catch his eye. But the reflection faded as quickly as it came, swallowed by the dull glow of the post office bulbs. The two volunteers glanced toward him again, and he felt the room's attention shift in small, subtle ways. Not openly hostile, just uncertain. He let out a slow breath, steadying himself, and looked around. A young mother bounced her toddler on her hip. An older man tapped his cane against the linoleum. Stacks of shipping boxes leaned against the far wall. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly off-kilter, as if the air itself carried a question he couldn't quite answer. Frank stepped forward with the line smoothing the sleeve of his jacket. At times like this, silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. He could sense eyes on him, not constant but frequent enough to land like soft taps on the shoulder. Someone behind him whispered, "Is that him?" Another answered, "I think so." He didn't respond. Instead, he studied the row of P.O. boxes ahead, each one identical except for the tiny brass numbers that gave people their sense of belonging in town. He wondered how quickly a story like yesterday's could ripple through Spring Willow. In his experience, truth was a slow walker. Rumor rode a faster horse. He took another quiet step forward, then another. Still the whispers followed him out the door. The spring afternoon carried a thin chill as Frank walked along Maple Street, hands deep in his jacket pockets. It was the kind of day when neighbors usually lingered on porches waving to anyone who passed. But today the waves felt slower, shorter. A few didn't rise at all. Outside the community center, two volunteers stood sorting donation boxes. Their voices carried farther than they intended. "Poor man," one whispered. "He's not what he used to be." "I heard he caused trouble at the cafe," the other replied. "And with Memorial Day coming up, we can't afford disruptions." Frank didn't stop walking. He didn't glare or correct them. He simply kept moving as though the words were no more than a sudden gust brushing his coat. But they weren't. They landed steady and familiar the way doubts tend to when offered with casual certainty. He turned the corner onto Cedar Lane, where Mrs. Carter's repaired chair now sat outside the cafe, catching the afternoon light. The wood looked smoother than it had in years. Someone had placed a folded blanket on the seat, though Frank hadn't been the one to add that touch. A soft voice called from behind him. Mr. Frank Lena stepped out from the cafe doorway, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She carried a small notebook, the kind she used for taking orders, though she didn't write anything in it now. "I was looking at the chair earlier," she said. "There's a mark underneath. I thought maybe—" She crouched beside the chair, lifting it slightly to show him. "See? It looks like the shape that was on your coin." Frank knelt down beside her, studying the faint carved lines, something like a shield or a crest softened by years of sun and use. It wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably familiar. "You've got sharp eyes," he said quietly. "So it is. From your coin," she pressed. He gave a small smile. "Another time, Lena." "Another time." She nodded, though he could tell she wanted to ask more. She stepped back as Harold emerged from the cafe, his clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. "Frank," Harold said, clearing his throat with official precision. "There's been some concern among the committee. I need to give you this." He handed over a folded form, the kind printed on thick paper, to make it feel heavier than it was. Frank didn't open it. He already knew the language warnings always had the same tone, even when delivered politely. "It's just procedure," Harold added, though his eyes never fully met Frank's. "A formality." Frank accepted it with a nod. "I understand." Harold walked off toward the square, satisfied the matter had been handled. Lena lingered a moment longer, her concerns settling into the space he didn't fill with words. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said softly. Frank didn't answer. He slipped the form into his jacket, then reached into the other pocket and closed his hand around the challenge coin. The metal turned beneath his thumb, steady and cool, as if reminding him of something he hadn't said aloud in a long time. He looked toward the open street, the town's chatter drifting like distant radio static full of lives that continued on without waiting for truth to catch up. Then came the moment he could no longer stay silent. The cafe grew quieter in the late afternoon, its windows catching the warm glow that softened every edge inside. Lena wiped down the counter one last time before sliding into the seat across from Frank. The hum of conversation faded as the last customers drifted out, leaving the room wrapped in a gentle stillness. Frank rested his hands on the table, fingers lightly tapping the grain of the wood. For a moment he seemed unsure where to begin. Then he reached into his pocket and placed the challenge coin between them. The metal caught the amber light, shimmering with the kind of glow that felt less like reflection and more like memory rising to the surface. "I've seen you watching this," he said. She nodded. "It feels important." "It is," he replied. He exhaled slowly, the way someone does before opening a part of themselves they've kept tucked away for years. "When I was younger," he began, "I didn't always fit in. I tried, but it felt like I was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Folks meant well, but I was treated like a burden more often than not." Lena leaned forward, listening without interrupting. "One day," Frank continued, "during a training rotation, I was sitting alone behind the barracks. Someone had cleared out space for an inspection, and I didn't realize I'd wandered into the way. I heard shouting before I saw anyone. A couple of men told me to move, that I was slowing things down, made it sound like I was the problem." His eyes lowered, not in shame, but in recollection, like watching an old reel of film, still carrying the scratches of its past. But then he said softly, "Another serviceman stepped in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold anyone. He just walked over and put his hand on my shoulder right here." Frank touched the fabric of his jacket. Not heavy, not a command, just steady. Lena's expression warmed. That simple gesture, he said, felt like someone laying a blanket over a shivering man. Not to hide him, just to say he wasn't alone. Frank brushed the coin lightly with his thumb. Then he gave me this. "Told me no one should be made to bow for being decent." He paused. The cafe clock ticked softly above them. It wasn't force, Frank murmured, just the weight of expectations he'd carried for years. The words hovered in the air as if acknowledging the invisible pressures that lingered in every town, every life. At the doorway, a faint shuffle broke the quiet. Harold stood there, frozen mid-step. He hadn't meant to overhear, but something in Frank's tone had anchored him. "Frank." Harold swallowed, lowering his clipboard. "I misunderstood you. I think everyone has." Frank offered a small, forgiving nod. "It's all right." The light through the window dimmed as the sun shifted, brushing soft shadows across the table. Frank picked up the coin and closed his hand around it, the motion gentle, like folding a blanket and protecting the memory it carried. Outside, the wind rustled the cafe's faded flag, lifting its edge as though the day itself had decided to listen. But the town wasn't done learning from him. The next morning carried a gentler brightness, the kind that made Spring Willow feel like a town stitched together with small courtesies. Frank stepped outside with his toolbox in hand, planning to fix a loose shutter on his porch, when he noticed a small group gathered near Mrs. Carter's walkway. 3 volunteers from the community center stood beside her, each holding something, a folded note, a thermos of coffee, a set of gardening gloves. Their voices drifted through the quiet street. "It seems we misunderstood him," one said. "We should have known better," another added. "Frank's always been the one helping everyone else." Mrs. Carter gave a firm nod, the kind that settled arguments without saying much. About time someone said it out loud. Frank paused mid-step. He didn't make his presence known, not yet. He watched as the volunteers walked toward the cafe, their steps purposeful, almost ceremonial. Curiosity nudged him forward, though he kept a respectful distance. Outside Spring Willow Cafe, the repaired wooden chair he'd worked on days earlier had been brought back to the porch, cleaned, polished, and placed carefully beside the entrance. A small wooden plaque hung from the top rail, carved with a steady hand. "Rest a while, fixed by a neighbor who cares." The words caught in Frank's chest, soft but sure. It wasn't grand and it wasn't loud, but somehow it felt like the town draping a blanket over him, the way that serviceman once had quiet protection woven from recognition rather than obligation. Lena appeared from inside, wiping her hands on a towel. She spotted Frank and hurried down the steps. "You see," she said, grinning, They wanted everyone to know the truth. Frank touched the plaque lightly, running his thumb over the carved letters. They didn't have to do this. "Well," Lena said, leaning against the railing, "if fixing things were an Olympic sport, I'd bet my lunch money on you." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that came from places in him that hadn't moved in a while. "That's so, absolutely," she replied with mock seriousness. "Gold medal hands down." A porch swing on the neighboring house creaked back and forth in the afternoon breeze, keeping time with the easy rhythm of their conversation. The movement was slow, steady, almost like the town itself was exhaling after holding something too tightly. Frank took a step back, looking at the cafe, the volunteers now talking among themselves, the way the sunlight softened the porch railing. He'd lived in many places where kindness was rare and often questioned, but here today it felt like something rediscovered. Still, the air felt lighter. A couple walking their dog paused to admire the chair. Someone across the street waved. Another person tipped their hat. Small gestures, but they gathered around Frank like a gentle tide pushing in from the shoreline. Lena nudged him lightly with her elbow. "You okay? I think so," he said, though the truth was deeper. He felt seen, not for a moment of misunderstanding, but for a lifetime of quiet choices no one had ever asked him to explain. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of choir rehearsal from the church hall 2 blocks away, soft notes rising and falling like memories stretching their limbs. Then Memorial Day morning brought something no one expected. Memorial Hall sat at the edge of Spring Willow's town square, its brick walls warmed by the afternoon sun. On Memorial Day morning, people moved in and out with a gentle hush, as if the building itself invited a softer way of speaking. Frank approached slowly, hands tucked in his pockets, the faintest hint of uncertainty in his steps. He had not expected to be called here, and certainly not by name. Inside, the light was different, cooler, filtered through tall windows that cast long, peaceful shadows across the polished floor. Rows of displays lined the hall, honoring decades of service, small-town sacrifice, and lives stitched into the nation's larger story. Lena waited near the center beside a new glass case that hadn't been there the last time Frank visited. When she saw him, her smile held something between pride and tenderness. "Come look," she said, stepping aside. Frank drew closer, breath catching before he even understood why. Inside the case, resting on a navy blue felt cloth, lay his challenge coin, the one he had carried for years, the one still warm, with the echoes of the story he'd shared only days earlier. The coin looked different under the hall's gentle lights, steadier somehow, as though its purpose had shifted from being held to being witnessed. Below it, on a small brass plaque, the inscription read, "No neighbor should be pushed down for trying to help." He stared at the words. They settled into him with a warmth that felt almost like someone draping a blanket across his shoulders, a gesture he remembered, and one this town had now returned in its own way. Lena moved to stand beside him. "They know now," she said softly. Frank nodded, emotion gathering behind his ribs in a way he didn't often allow. "That's enough." Outside the tall windows, the porch lights along Main Street flicked on one by one as dusk approached, their golden glow slipping across the glass case and scattering tiny reflections across the floor. The effect was gentle, like lanterns being lit in gratitude. People wandered through, quietly pausing to read the plaque or study the coin. Some recognized Frank and offered small nods, acknowledgments without ceremony, which suited him far better than anything loud or formal. He returned each gesture with a modest smile. The hall's air felt still, almost reverent. In the quiet, Frank felt the same enveloping calm he had once felt when that serviceman placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. It reminded him how kindness, when freely given, could cover a person more completely than any blanket. It could steady a life. It could change a town. He stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of the years settle gently instead of sharply. The hall seemed to breathe with him, its walls warmed by memory and goodwill. As the last beams of daylight brushed the display, Lena squeezed his arm lightly before stepping back. "You ready to head out?" she asked. Frank nodded again, gaze lingering on the coin. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." They walked toward the doors together, the soft glow of porch lights spilling in from outside, guiding their way with familiar warmth. If this story moved, you share it forward. The lights along Spring Willow's porch-lined street flickered on as Frank lingered inside Memorial Hall, watching the quiet glow settle over the glass case that now held his coin, its soft shine steady as a lamp in a winter window. Still, he felt no triumph in the display, only a gentle settling, a sense that kindness offered without return had finally found its way home, carried by neighbors who had learned to lift rather than push down. Then, as the choir practiced faintly in the distance, he rested his hand on the railing and breathed in the hush of the room, realizing how small acts held long enough become the stories a town chooses to remember. And when he stepped outside into the cooling dusk, the porch lights swayed lightly in the breeze, as if reminding him to pass the warmth forward.